That was just awesome. I kind of just want to play that 5 more times and then we'll go home. But instead, you're going to listen to a sermon. So first, I want to say thank you, Leslie. But we should also not forget to thank Leslie for that song, I Will Never Leave You. That was the showstopper in a little-remembered Broadway production called Sideshow. Sideshow is a musical based on the lives of Daisy and Violet Hilton, conjoined twins from England who had a career in vaudeville, burlesque, and some films, and whom eventually left public life. They were linked at the pelvis and actually shared a circulatory system. The musical is deeply engaging, following the twins from a time in the sideshow of major fairs and festivals on to a life on stage as a featured act. The sideshow, for those who don't know, is an area at a state fair or other kind of fair where there are attractions that people pay to see. But those attractions are usually people, not things. The musical was not an accurate representation of the lives of these real women, but it went on to achieve a passionate following, likely for its unique subject matter, and also for the star turns each of the lead actors took in the production. Their work was so compelling that they were nominated for Tony Awards, the highest honor Broadway theater bestows every year, but these actors hold the unique place of being co-nominated for a Tony Award. This is Alice Ripley and Emily Skinner, which I'm sure all the theater nerds want me to say. It's a fairly standard for co-stars in a production to get a nomination each, but these actors were nominated together for these roles they played side by side, and they will likely always be remembered together for that achievement. They didn't win. Sadly, Titanic and a revival of Chicago that same year kind of edged everyone out, and Bebe Neuwirth won Best Actress for her portrayal of Velma Kelly, also loosely based on a real person, a real woman, who was acquitted of murder, actually, in 1924 in Chicago. It's a tough beat, but Bebe Neuwirth is not anyone to be trifled with. Now, you might have noticed I've gone on a bit of a tangent here. Theater aficionados are likely a little delighted for this deep dive into that faithful year of theater, and some of you are wondering whether I've gotten a little distracted once again. And that is actually the point, friends. Sideshows are a distraction from the main event of the main point of something. The nitty-gritty of who was nominated for what and what year is not really the point of what we are talking about. As we approach this coming week together, I think many of us are struck by the difference so many are feeling about planning. The days of togetherness and giving thanks that so many enjoy at this time of year and in the month that follows are changing, have changed. Seemingly like everything else in so many of our lives, things we come to accept as regular, delightful things will not look the same, might not even come to be at all. And it is like the things that used to be at the center of what we do together on these days, the gathering, the turkey, the inappropriate comments from our aging relatives, are mere sideshows to an illness raging across so much of a nation, seeming so unwilling to stem its tide. But for some of us, that's actually not that big a difference. For a lot of people, this idea of Thanksgiving really isn't remembered anymore for the reason it began as a national holiday. And it wasn't really ever that huge a holiday, really. President Washington agreed to make a proclamation and announce a day of Thanksgiving. Jefferson didn't care for it, so we didn't have one. It was really Abraham Lincoln who sort of brought it back, and then Grant added it as an official holiday, but that was an act of Congress in 1885 that made it a paid federal holiday. And it was actually FDR who kept changing the dates a bit in the 30s and the 40s until 1942, when the fourth Sunday of November was when Thanksgiving would be observed. So, even people who call it a, quote, institution might not realize that there wasn't even uniform agreement about when the date should even be celebrated until about 80 years ago. And that is a long, long time from the first event in 1621 it was supposed to recognize, the purported meal shared between pilgrims, or separatists really, and members of the Wampanoag Nation. But let's get even more honest. How many people who really love Thanksgiving remember and honor that purported meeting and meal? How many people really get into the history before they get together for football, beer, and inappropriate comments from relatives? Not many. Even people who say they love this holiday usually love it. Why? Because their family is together. They take their pilgrimages all to be together. And then they take a day off from virtually everything else. So apart from being with family and loved ones, the history part for many, many people is really just what? A sideshow. That's right. And for members of First Nations, this day signifies something entirely different. This Thursday will mark the 50th anniversary of a holding of a National Day of Mourning that was founded by the United American Indians of New England, or UAIN, an education and advocacy group that seeks to debunk the pilgrim mythology surrounding this event. Among the stark facts, UAIN reminds those who will listen, and really one of the most important historical facts about Thanksgiving is that were it not for the Wampanoag Nation and its kind citizens, not only would there never have been a Thanksgiving, there would not have been any pilgrims, or really, as I said, separatists. We only started calling them pilgrims later. That's not how they referred to themselves. Because the Wampanoag Nation provided the food in hard winters that kept the separatists alive. I do encourage you all to look more at the other historical facts UNA seeks tirelessly to share with others about this purported event, and whether it should in fact be the event that is remembered by a national holiday. Instead, they host a gathering annually on the hill where the meal was set to take place, and recall the ways that the dangerous myth of pilgrims still contributes to the devastation of the members of First Nations throughout the world. And that, friends, is no sideshow. In fact, the relationship of the inheritors of the separatist action and their cousins, the Puritans, down the coast a little, the inheritors of the wealth of a nation that displaced entire First Nations, that disregarded the health and the lives of First Nations, that dismembered the connection between the many First Nations and the land to which their lives were so deeply connected, the inheritors of the Puritan and Pilgrim promise need to keep at the center of their understanding all that they are really inheriting. And friends, I gotta tell you, I am talking to us. There are 15 congregations in the United States today who can trace an unbroken lineage to earlier than 1700, and who are also Calvinist congregations. That's included, Presbyterian, Congregational, Reformed, and Puritan, among others, folks who came out of Calvinist theology. Today, 6 of those 15 oldest congregations in the United States are what? Unitarian Universalist. So, when I say Unitarian Universalist churches are inheritors of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, which I acknowledge were very different belief systems but are related all the same. When I say that we are inheritors of their traditions, of their buildings, of their wealth as a movement, I'm not being metaphorical in the slightest. And for a people who are the inheritors of this tradition in some ways, it's essential to keep at the center of how we are together and how we relate to those around us. Our original relationship to the First Nations that were located around our founding congregations, both then and now. The first title, legal title, that passed from an Indian nation to Pilgrim settlers in 1629, passed from the Wampanoag, who maintained their tribal sovereignty throughout parts of Massachusetts, to those who had found the Plymouth colony and the first church in Plymouth, which is today a Unitarian Universalist church. See, for our faith friends, perhaps more than any other, the relationship between the national myth of white superiority or supremacy over any other nation or form of knowledge and understanding the world has around us really is at the beginning of our ancestral spiritual DNA. Now, this does not go unheeded by our faith. I don't want you to think this is news to Unitarian Universalists. Many of the most prolific and meaningful ways of caring for our siblings today comes out of our movement. All the way back in 1970, it was Ann Gilmore, an attorney and member of a neighboring UU congregation in Brookline, who fought and won the right to protect the Wampanoag land from developers. And as recently as March of this year, a year I know we are all eager to see go, the Department of the Interior planned to revoke the trust in which the Wampanoag Nation's land is held, which was established by a child of this very congregation, President Obama, in 2015, which would effectively have closed the Montessori school in the Wampanoag Nation, disbanded their independent police force, would have forced a slew of zoning regulations upon a housing complex for nation elders, among others, after it was already done being constructed. It was this year that the Unitarian Universalist Association backed the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe Reservation Reaffirmation Act with a major push. And the act in the House of Representatives passed by a margin of, wait for it, 275 to 146. If that is not a showing of bipartisan support these days, I don't know what is. And of course, it was in the Senate after a tweet from the White House that read, "Republicans shouldn't vote for H.R. 312, a special interest casino bill backed by Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren. It is unfair and doesn't treat Native Americans equally." That bill halted all progress in the Senate. I think that is the first time I've quoted that person actually in a sermon, so I imagine it was triggering for some here to hear that blatant racist language tinged with the irony of a person whose failed casinos regularly sought special interest considerations, not the least of which was bankruptcy protection when it was run fully into the ground by inept, incompetent management. But that's another sermon. But the bill to protect the Wampanoag land sits languishing in the Senate to this day. A petition sent around by the UUA is just a few hundred votes shy of 300,000 as we sit here today. Trust me, at the end of this sermon, I will put the petition in the chat and we might be able to push it over the 300,000 mark. But signing petitions, even taking the government to court, drafting legislation, these are all very modern, very material, very UU things to be doing about a situation. In some ways, I'm sorry to tell you, they are a sideshow from what is at the core of this relationship for those in First Nations who think about this subject and who write about this subject. One, and perhaps the most visible of these people, is Professor George Tinker, an Osage Nation elder and a professor of theology at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. Tinker's work focuses on Native American liberation theology. He, in point of fact, wrote the book on Native American liberation theology. And in his work on the subject, he opines, I quote, "Indigenous peoples are struggling with existence in ways that are not and probably cannot be addressed by class analysis at all. Rather, they are rooted in the economic need of the colonizer to quiet our claims to the land and to mute our moral judgment on the United States' long history of violence and conquest in North America." And George Tinker contributed significantly to one of the landmark works of anti-racist theologies edited and published by the Unitarian Universalist Association called Soul Work. In Soul Work, Tinker contributes his own essay called "Racism and Anti-Racism in a Culture of Violence, Dreaming a New Dream." In that essay, he cites the foundational work of American Indian lawyer by Felix Cohen, who reiterates that, and I quote, "American Indians are the miner's canary of U.S. society. Just as the death of the canary would alert miners that it was time to abandon the mine for lack of oxygen, so the health and well-being of American Indians should reflect back to North Americans how healthy our own society is. That is to say, the fate of American Indians is reflective of the spiritual condition of the rest of U.S. society, and that the malaise of Indian peoples is deeply symbolic of the ever-growing U.S. dominance in this new world order we now gently call globalization, even if we actually mean Americanization. Tinker does not mince words. And he goes on to suggest moving the idea of liberation theology at its roots past a preferential option for the poor and those on the margins of society. He calls for something very close to so many of our hearts. He calls for freedom. And he calls for that freedom from a place we all treasure ourselves. His words. The churches need to create a new kind of liberation theology. We need to dream a liberation theology that makes a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed, but also talks about how each one of us can become free. Indian peoples will never be free on this continent until white Americans are also free, until men are freed from the systematic structures of sexism, which automatically give privilege to men in this society, even to those of us who struggle against our own privileging and claim to be listening to our feminist colleagues. You see what he's doing here? Freed from something that looks like a privilege, but is really a source of pain. And finally, he addresses good church people who want very much to be doing the work of anti-racism, yet find themselves wrapped in a world seemingly surrounded by so much that prevents effective engagement with that work, so many obstacles to its success. And he says this: thus, when church people boldly act in resistance, they are actually acting against their own immediate and narrow self-interest on behalf of the poor, the oppressed, and the colonized and marginalized other of this world. This is the courage that will generate a new dream, that will imagine into existence a future of harmony and balance for our world and all those who inhabit it. And almost as if we realize it suddenly, we are joined together with our siblings in this work, as if we share the same circulatory system, or if our DNA is entangled from long ago. Whether we like it or not, we must hear in our own ears the perfect ring of the words, "I will never leave you." As much as we like to hear this as a promise of affection, it's better to hear it as a promise from our siblings who suffer real, tangible, and intentional harm at the hands of a system that wants them to be silent and to go away. But "I will never leave you" is all that comes back. We're joined, friends, in a struggle for a soul of a nation. We're joined, friends, in a movement to save our own lives. We're joined, friends, not in a sideshow or a distraction of myths and legends, but in the tangible lineage of faith and relationship to our siblings in the First Nations, whose struggles, trauma, and endurance of violence that goes on to this day, many say, laid the foundation for the violence this nation built on our siblings' ancestral home as it endures at a rate far greater than any of its peer nations. A violence in speech, in action, and in inaction that has threatened the freedoms of so many for so long, so senselessly. When we talk about freedom, friends, and if it is something we want for ourselves and for the generations to come, the voice of our elder tells us that freedom is only available in any measure to the precise extent that all others are free. I know some of you think that is just minister talk. I know some of you think it's a little woo-hoo. But trust me, the reckoning of an age of violence and rage is here. It is around us. No matter what the sideshow seems to be, it's right here before us. The echo comes back again and again. "I will never leave you. I will never go away." And that, friends, is a good thing, because the reckoning of a young nation like ours makes with a nation that was here for 12,000 years before us is a reckoning we will have whether we like it or not. Because the reckoning of a faith tradition with a people who provided the land for one of its first and oldest churches is a reckoning we will have whether we like it or not. Because the reckoning of a person of faith, each person of faith must have with a people uprooted, detached, and forgotten, is a reckoning we must have so that we might one day be free. is a reckoning we must have so that our siblings might also be free, is a reckoning we must have so that rather than the reminder from our siblings that they will never leave us, we can be the ones to say to our siblings, I will never leave you. I will never go away. Beside you is where I will stay. We are co-actors in the event that is ongoing, on-moving, and never ceasing. The event that has fueled the engine of Americanization for 5 centuries and counting. Yes, across a continent half an ocean away, yet no less present in many ways in the lands we know here. And it is this event, this central relationship at the foundation of this new nation, that tells us how sick this new nation might really be, yet holds the promise of real healing, real siblinghood, real freedom. Not just for me and you, not just for us and them, but for everyone born. We are one, though we're two, and I will never leave you. And may it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen. Please join me now in singing our hymn of reflection, For Everyone Born.